is a fear within the great house that everyone here is threatened by an evil as yet unseen, an evil that has something to do with an antique shop and those who live there. And on this night, there is reason to fear, for the violent actions of an eldritch and unimaginable creature will result in terror at Collinwood. Before we descend into the secret underground lair hidden beneath the profane cairn of the Leviathans, I want to thank Bill Mize, who has a variety of great podcasts, which are all grouped under the Bill Makes Podcasts banner. He has Bill Watches Movies, which there are quite a few episodes of that. There's also Bill Watches Serials. There's Monsters by the Minute. So he has a series of great podcasts that you can find at billmakespodcast.com, and you can also find them on your favorite podcast apps. Bill reached out to me and asked me to send him a promo to include in his show because he does these fantasy sponsors, but he's just very kindly promoting other shows, which is very nice of him. So I didn't have a promo for Terror at Collinwood, so I made one and I sent it along to Bill, and he'll be including that in one of his upcoming episodes. And I'll also put the promo up at the Terror at Collinwood YouTube channel. Also, just a quick apology here. Toward the end of the episode, in the last 15 minutes or so, there is some audio distortion, unfortunately, some echoing and some static crackling sounds. I tried to fix as much of that as I could, but there was only so much I could do. I am definitely not the most technologically advanced individual, shall we say, but this is a great episode with two absolutely sensational guests, so let's get to it. Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, your hostess, Penny Dreadful, aka Danielle, and I am thrilled and delighted by my guests today. It's a double dose of terror today because I have Rick Lay and Stephen Mark Rainey joining me to talk about the Leviathans. But first, let's introduce these guys. Of course, Rick Lay is the author of books on pulp heroes like The Shadow and Doc Savage. During the 80s and 90s, he wrote articles expanding on the world Newton universe concepts of Philip Jose Farmer for pulp magazine fanzines. Most of these articles have been collected by Altus Press. His short stories have appeared regularly in the Tales of the Shadow Men anthologies published by Black Coat Press. He wrote an excellent article entitled The Collinsport Horror, Dark Shadows, and the Cthulhu Mythos for the Lovecraft e-zine, which I will link to in the description. And Stephen Mark Rainey is the author of numerous novels, including Blue Devil Island, Dark Shadows, Dreams of the Dark with Elizabeth Massey, The Lebo Coven, and his newest book, Fugue Devil Resurgence. His short fiction has appeared in over 90 publications, including Cemetery Dance, Shroud, Love in Vain 2, Robert Bloch's Psychos, and many more. For a decade, he edited the award-winning Death Realm magazine. He also wrote the Dark Shadows Big Finish audio dramas, The Path of Fate, Blood Dance, and The Curse of the Pharaoh, as well as a great unpublished Dark Shadows novel, The Labyrinth of Souls, which fans can read on his site, and I'll post a link to that. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, hey, it's my pleasure to have you guys here. People have written to me and said, when you do Leviathans, you should talk to these two guys. And from the beginning, you were the two guests I had in mind to do the Leviathan storyline, to talk about it, because I know you guys are fans of the Leviathan storyline and of the works of H.P. Lovecraft as well. But before we get into the Leviathans, let's talk a little bit about how you guys got into Dark Shadows and just classic horror in general. And we'll start with Rick and then jump over to Mark.
Well, I got into horror watching Chiller Theater.
Oh, great.
Creature features in the New York area. There was always some show on a local station. Which
Zachary.
I watched him too at one point, but it was always when it was showing Universal horror movies for the most part, and some American International. Long while before Hammer got syndicated in the United States. And when I was in the sixth grade, so this would have been, well, actually, during the summer of 1965, my grandparents lived with us during the summer at a summer house in Breezy Point, New York. And they used to watch soap operas. They watched General Hospital. And then I saw these commercials for this new soap opera while they were watching it called Dark Shadows. And it was suggesting that it was going to be a ghost story. So I watched the premiere of Dark Shadows.
Oh, wow.
And I watched it for about a month. And then I felt the story's going nowhere. It seems to be a murder mystery or a kid trying to kill his father. It was the original version of David Collins. And I gave up. And then about a year later, or probably about more like 8 months later, when I was in school, people just tell me there's a vampire on Dark Shadows. Now, I tried to watch one episode and I saw Barnabas and they didn't show the coffin or the fangs in that episode. So I didn't watch Dark Shadows again. So then that summer, I was back with my grandparents and they had it on. And it was at the point in the story where Barnabas has kidnapped Maggie and had her locked in the basement. And that's when I got into it. So that's how I got into Dark Shadows.
Did you continue to watch it for the rest of the
watched it regularly.
Oh, great. And how about you, Mark? I remember you used to post a lot on the Dark Shadows forums. So we're both members over there and all the great discussions. But how did you first get into all of this?
Well, as a little kid, I caught a lot of the black and white horror movies that would come on TV, and they scared me pretty good as a youngster, but I could not stop watching them. I mean, if there was one on, I was going to watch it. And we spent a lot of time at my grandparents down in Georgia. I lived in Virginia at the time. In fact, I'm at the house where I grew up right now, in the same room where I first started watching Dark Shadows, just by coincidence.
Wow.
I usually watch the Popeye Club and Speed Racer and the afternoon shows like that. And just by chance, one afternoon, I think this was the very first episode, because I remembered I had seen a commercial or something with, the logo for Dark Shadows. And that looks kind of creepy. I'm going to watch it. And so it turned out that was the first episode. And I watched however long we were there, probably 3 or 4 more days, and I watched those. As at the time I would have been 6 or 7 years old at the time. So I think it was the music that actually grabbed me. I'm like, this stuff is eerie. And even though it didn't get eerie right up front, it grabbed me. And so when we got back to Virginia, we found that our local ABC affiliate didn't run Dark Shadows.
Oh, no.
The only way you could get it was to have cable TV. And in 66, very few people around here had cable TV. But later I found out my friend Frank, who lived up the road, well, he had cable TV. So I invited myself over every chance I could so we could watch Dark Shadows over there, but it was very sporadic. I didn't have any kind of sense of continuity of the show. All I knew was that at one point, I'd heard about Barnabas Collins, vampire and stuff, and I finally went to Frank's house, turned on Dark Shadows, and there he was. It was Barnabas Collins, and he was a vampire, and it was actually scary to me at the time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't long after, well, I don't remember exactly when that was. It had to have been during the 1795 period. There was a snowstorm that I ended up at Frank's house rather than coming back to my house, because there was a very steep hill. And so Frank's mom came and picked us up from school because we got out early. And we plopped down to watch Dark Shadows that afternoon. And it was an episode where Lieutenant Nathan Forbes is waiting for Barnabas with a crossbow, and he shoots Barnabas with the crossbow, and Barnabas is like, "You didn't get my heart, Lieutenant." And that scared me so freaking bad. Yeah. I did not sleep a wink that night. And from then on, I was just a diehard Dark Shadows fan. And so in 69, we got cable TV at my house, and that was the very beginning of the Leviathans episodes. They were just starting up. So to me, having only seen Dark Shadows sporadically prior to that, to me, it wasn't like I was getting into something that was subpar. To me, this was Dark Shadows. There's a very mean Barnabas. He's got fangs. We've got deep breathing in a room. I was absolutely mesmerized.
And that's a great segue, because that's what we're going to talk about today is the Leviathans. Dan Curtis, he is the one, based on interviews, with Sam Hall and things, that Dan Curtis, his assistant, I believe, brought a book of Lovecraft tales to him. And he was really into doing this storyline. He was excited about doing this primarily Dunwich horror inspired storyline with other elements as well. And I think at the time, we, up until this point, we've been seeing more traditional Gothic archetypes in the show, of course, the vampires, the ghosts, the werewolves, zombies, etc. But this was something really unusual, I think, for the average viewer. Even horror fans perhaps may not have been as aware of this type of thing, the cosmic horror, Lovecraft type story. So what is it about the Leviathans that you like? What is it that attracts you to that storyline?
I had not read Lovecraft at that time. I later, I think a year after that storyline was done, I actually read the Dunwich horror. Mm-hmm. And I saw where everything was coming from.
Yes.
But at the time, it was a very unpopular storyline. And it was unpopular. Some people think it's because people couldn't get a grasp on what the Leviathans were, because it was so original. Even though, Lovecraft had been around for a while, but the average horror viewer, you had no idea what was going on with the Leviathans. While when the werewolf storyline first started up, you knew what was going on from the beginning. If you had been a horror aficionado, at least in the classic movies. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I suspect the reason it really wasn't popular was because it opened up with Barnabas. It had gone from being a villain to an anti-hero.
Yeah.
And he was possessed by these strange spirits from the dawn of time, and he became a villain. And that, I think, is what made it initially unpopular. Yeah. But I rewatched it and got over that. I was okay with the elements of the Leviathans and whatever. And it eventually picked up because they realized the mistake that they had Barnabas as the main villain. They shifted him away, and he didn't have any he wasn't a reluctant villain like when he had initially been a vampire.
Yeah.
He was totally evil and a devoted agent of the Leviathans. Then they started to have him develop the guild again, and then he broke free and gets cursed with being a vampire. And they bring back one of the classic villains, Nicholas Blair, to be the head baddie in the Leviathan storyline. And that's Humbert Allen Estreto, was this great actor.
Yes.
That I think that's why it regained popularity. And also the Leviathan Messiah, who was Jeff Hawkes, played by Christopher Pennock. In the early part of the Leviathan storyline, they had this monster that you first saw as a disembodied spirit, becomes a baby, and then goes through these stages where he's being played by different child actors. And even though he could be very creepy, there was an element of a movie called Village of the Damned.
Yes.
Which may have been influenced by, it was based on a book called The Midwig Cuckoos by, I think, John Wyndham. And that had elements of the Dunwich horror. The kids were somewhat frightening, but Chris Pennock did a very good job as Jeff Hawkes. So near the end of the storyline, we were getting a lot of great villains.
Yeah.
We had Michael Stroker return. He had been Aristide in 1897, and then he was playing a similar character named Bruno in this storyline. But the imagery of the Leviathan box and the Leviathan book, I think all that serpent jewelry imagery was very creepy and developed a following.
Yeah.
He also integrated werewolves. very well in the story, says enemies of the Leviathan.
Yeah, and you pointed out that came from Robert E. Howard, which was interesting because I wasn't aware of that. What was the Shadow Kingdom? I think you said a war between mankind and an alliance of non-human races. Yeah,
Lovecraft dealt with wars between godlike beings. And there are alien races fighting, but they're very divorced from resembling human beings.
Sure.
Any which way.
Yeah.
Robert E. Howard had this idea of mankind battling an alliance of monster races, which were serpent men, werewolf, bird people, they were sort of animal people. And they kind of took that in the Dark Shadows, the writers, and developed it or sort of altered it so it was the monster races fighting among themselves.
Yeah.
And the werewolves had been allies of a race that Robert E. Howard created called the Serpent Men. And the writers changed it to make them enemies. Now, the Serpent Men had the ability to shape-shift and replace human beings. It was not like the Skrulls in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And the writers changed that in that the Leviathans, whose symbol was a seven-headed snake, could possess, it was implied that was their true form, but we never really saw it.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that later on, too, what the true form could be. But it's serpent-inspired, you believe, yeah?
They said it was a spirit, a soul was out of body. The Leviathans were described as. So the Leviathans could possess human beings instead of doing an actual shapeshift. That's how they kind of adapted that idea.
Mark, let's get your input here in terms of why the Leviathan story. You talked a little bit about it, discovering it first as a child, and that was kind of like you saw that, and that was Dark Shadows to you. So, what is it about the Leviathan storyline today that resonates with you, and why do you think it was? You concur with what Rick said with regard to why it was not as popular at the time?
Largely, I do. Like I said, the introduction of the Leviathans to me was the creepiest part because, you had a thing you couldn't see and you'd hear, there was the closed door in the upstairs of the antique shop owned by the Todds, and you'd hear this deep breathing coming out of there. And this to me was a classic example of how you don't see what it is. And given Dark Shadow's budget, thank God you didn't see what it was. But when you heard it, or when I did, it scared me half to death. And the memory of, as the Leviathan story progressed, I was a little disappointed by the time it got to Chris Pennick and he fell in love with Carol. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. He's a monstrous dude. He kills people. So to me, that started losing me. And the second scariest part of that was the youngest kid, the one named Alex. He looked like my cousin.
Oh, gosh.
That scared the fuck out of me because he looked like my cousin. And he sounded like my cousin. Maybe a little bit meaner. So the kid, when I was a kid, forgive me, but I've never been a big fan of kids. And when I was a kid, I didn't like kids. They scared me. Little scary kids like Alex there. And at the time, I thought, okay, we've got these great kid actors doing scary things. And then Jeb is at first, he can be intimidating and all, but he starts softening up. And I didn't care much for that. And also, like I said, I hadn't seen the evolution of Barnabas from mean vampire to sympathetic vampire to, normal person racked by guilt and everything, to the point where he becomes hand-wringing and ineffective. And that always kind of pissed me off. So I was glad that we've got a mean Barnabas again. Well, back then, I never knew Barnabas really wasn't mean. To me, he was just always a meanie, and I kind of like that. And to this day, I feel like I know they had to have the character evolve, but I always preferred it when Barnabas had that dark, hard, strong edge about him. It just made him a lot more effective than, bemoaning everybody's fate while sitting in his easy chair going, what can we do? What can we do?
I think when he was human, when he was made human again, at least temporarily, it's when he's a vampire. The thing about Barnabas is although he did become the protector of the family, in some respects, he was always very dangerous, especially when he was a vampire. I mean, he killed Carl. He even at that point when he's trying to save David, he's killing off a member of the Collins family. Barnabas was unpredictable, and I think that's part of what made him fascinating, is that those shades of gray with Barnabas. He could do good things. He could also do really bad things. So but he was always very.
Yeah, that was what I felt was the best portrayal when that dark side of him, if not overtook the good side, it showed through so blatantly. And I always appreciated that about the character. But in the Leviathans, I did enjoy seeing Dennis Patrick as Carolyn's father, because I remembered, that he had not been a good man, and yet he seemed to be in this, trying to really turn things around, and then look what happens to him, and I thought that's actually pretty freaking tragic.
Right.
And I thought that was a great part of that, although, there's the infamous still photo of him.
Yes. It was great bringing him back. And that was a great, we're kind of jumping around the story. I want to get into a little bit more in terms of the key points of the storyline, but that is great that they brought Paul Stoddard back, because that's a thread that went back to the beginning of the show, and tying up the Jason Maguire, what he pulled with Jason Maguire, and bringing him back years later is just for a long time viewers, that must have been especially exciting to see. Well, they brought Paul Stoddard into the show, and to have him played by Dennis Patrick too was just fantastic.
Yeah.
What a great.
That was great. He got in such a great actor, man. Like Rick, though, I had not read Lovecraft prior to the Leviathans. In fact, it was quite a few years later. I didn't read Lovecraft till I was in college, when a friend of mine had a whole bunch of the old Valentine Lovecraft paperbacks. And he said, these seem like books you might like. So I started reading all those. And when I got to the Dunwich, I think I had seen the AIP movie, the Dunwich Horror, but that was that at the time. That was probably my only real exposure to Lovecraft at that time. But when I read the story, I thought, this is kind of the Leviathans issue. And the more I read of it, the more I came to understand, and this was long after Dark Shadows was off the air, and there wasn't much in the media. Dark Shadows wasn't forgotten, not by a long shot, but at least for me, it was still way in the background of things. It wasn't at the forefront. It just sort of tickled a memory there.
The fascinating thing too with what they did with the Dunwich Horror was they took Wilbur Whateley and combined him with his brother, who's locked up in the room, and turned him into one person, or creature rather. But it's definitely I think. With Barnabas, we have Barnabas at the end of 1897, which was an extremely popular storyline and the highest ratings that the show got. And then he goes back into the past through the portrait with Kitty Soames, who is literally this time the reincarnation of Josette. They go through the portrait. They end up in 1797, and Barnabas is, overtaken by these cloaked figures, and then they send him to the present with the box, with the Naga box, and he is. Even when Barnabas was at his worst as a vampire, Barnabas was passionate. When he was deadly and passionate, and he could also be tragic, and there was an emotional component. This is an emotionless Barnabas, cold, detached, aloof, and I think that was very disconcerting as well for the audience. And for Julia Hoffman, Julia notices that something is off about Barnabas, really off about Barnabas. And I think this is also where Julia becomes, Julia was always a prominent character in the show, but there are stretches without Julia, like in 1897.
Until she's brought in to play a role there for a time.
Or 1795. Here, Julia becomes a protagonist, and she is the protagonist in the show, because now Barnabas is the main antagonist. back to being the main antagonist of the show, but this is a very cold, detached Barnabas. The thing that finally shakes him out of the Leviathan's control later on is the fact that they command him to kill Julia when she cannot be brought under the sway of the Leviathans. The alternative is to kill her, and this is where Barnabas finally, this is where he starts to break free of their control later on. It's when they want him to kill Julia Hoffman, his best friend. He, after all they've been through, this is where he starts to break free of the Leviathan's control. But this happens a little bit later on. And then the Todds come in, these new characters that Philip and Megan, who open up their antique shop, and they're the chosen ones. They're given the box, which contains the essence of the Leviathan creature, as we've talked about, the children. Yeah.
Joseph Alexander Michael.
Those three stages, and then finally Jabez Hawks. Rick, you touched on this a little bit, but what do you guys think the true form of the Leviathan creature is? I used to think, when I was a kid, when I watched Leviathan, I thought the Leviathan storyline was really cool when I was a kid. It was so different and strange, and I hadn't read Lovecraft yet at that point. I did shortly thereafter, but at that point I hadn't yet read Lovecraft. I just thought it was really weird and creepy, but I always kept waiting for them to show what it looked like. Like I wanted to see what it was. Probably for the best that I didn't, because I may have gone mad. Perhaps I already did, just from that breathing in the room. But at the time, based on the Naga imagery, I assumed that it must have looked something like that. It must have been inspired by that. But that doesn't seem terrifying enough to drive someone insane. And I saw someone draw like a hybrid almost of I ran across it online years ago. It had the Naga look to it with the serpent heads, but it was sort of combined with this Lovecraftian idea where it looked really scary looking, like disturbing. Like it was not the proportions were all really strange. So what do you guys, starting with Rick and then Mark, what do you guys think the Leviathan form might actually look like?
I would think multiple heads, serpent-like neck, but more humanoid face.
Okay.
Than reptile.
Oh, interesting. I like that. What about you, Mark?
Do you recall the Dunwich Horror with Dean Stockwell? And there's this flash of the thing behind the door. And it's actually, and when they finally actually showed the thing, it's silly and yet disturbing because it's like a face with all these serpentine tentacles that may have faces on them. And if I took that into maybe a less unintentionally, I'm not even sure it's unintentionally funny in a way. I look at it now and I'm like, oh, look at that. But I remember seeing that when I was a youngster and thinking, holy crap, man, that thing's scary as hell. So I did envision something with multiple, if not heads, sentient appendages, things that made this array of whipping, serpentine things that might not look quite like the Naga box figure, but definitely something with a lot of thrashing, snapping, intelligent, with an intelligence to it. And that may be kind of vague, but I think that's part of the point of Lovecraft is that it leaves, he will be explicit about certain things and other things are very suggestive. So he leaves your brain to paint the most vivid picture possible of these things.
Yeah.
And that's how I envisioned this thing. Not quite describe, you could describe its attributes, but not what was truly in it, what was behind it.
I like that. It's like the human mind can't fully process what it. I think Barnabas even tells Julia at one point, it's like nothing. It's indescribable. He makes some comment to that effect. It's like nothing that could be comprehended. Or he made some comment to that effect. So this creature grows and eventually becomes Jeb Hawks. And all through this time, Carolyn, who is forever destined to be linked up with whatever monster is on the show romantically, but it's every single time. But she is supposed to be the chosen one, the bride of the Leviathan creature. And Jeb falls in love with Carolyn over the course of this period of time. We also have other characters coming back. We have Angelique is back in the present day, which is great. And she's been working as a model, apparently. She's with Sky Rumson, and they're They're living off on this island. We got Grant Douglas, who shows up, who is Quentin. Quentin
Right.
Collins comes back, and Barnabas, under the influence of the Leviathans, because the Leviathans are taking over all of these members of the Collins family. Some people are susceptible to being taken over. I show them the book, or which I believe that book must be sort of the analog for the Necronomicon.
I would assume so.
Yeah. So the Leviathans take over members of the Collins family, including Elizabeth and David. Amy falls under their sway, but Quentin loses his memory. Barnabas hits him with his car. Grant Douglas is the only name he's going by. There's also Olivia Corey, who is Amanda Harris, who's now in the present as well. So that storyline is going on. But I love it when David and Amy see Quentin and they're totally freaked out at first.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that was good.
Which is interesting because they remember, talking about Barnabas went back in time and changed history where Quentin didn't die, right? So he was never a ghost, right? He's immortal now because of this Dorian Gray painting, as we see, which it looks like the Ivan Albright painting. It looks a lot like the from the classic film. So Quentin is in the picture. He gets his memory back when he sees this painting. What do you guys think about this whole idea of the Leviathans wanting to reclaim their place on? It's interesting. Like, they want to use Collinwood as their base of operation, or Collinsport as their starting point, and then they link them up to Nicholas Blair, who they also bring back. It's interesting. They're bringing back all these characters: Paul Stoddard, Nicholas Blair, etc. So what are your thoughts on all of this? Initially, they start out with this idea that the Leviathans are this eldritch race that predates humanity, but then they also go in the direction of, they also happen to be these beings of the underworld that are somehow linked to Satan, to Diabolos, and Nicholas Blair is sort of put in charge of them. He comes in to sort of course correct what's going on with Jeb. So what do you think? Do you like the idea of linking them with Blair and Diabolos, or no?
I'm okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
They sort of made Nicholas Blair a monster race expert.
Mm. Yeah.
We've got two plots. And the first plot is to create this Frankenstein race. And the second plot is to revive the Leviathans. And they said it was originally his plan.
Yeah.
In the early episodes, there's the references to a guy named Strack. And I think originally he was going to be the main villain. And he was played by, I can't think of the actor's name.
Oh, John Harkins.
Yeah, John Harkins, who was Garth Blackwood and a chemist in...
Horace Gladstone. Yeah.
And I think Nicholas Blair was a course correction on the show. They're saying we need a more powerful villain for the audience than Strack. So they just brought him back, I think, rather quickly. I would like to have seen more of it. Mm-hmm. But they did something weird at times with Jeb Hawkes. There were storylines that are not developed about it. There was some flashback with Quentin telling the kids, don't trust Jeb, when he was a ghost. So we knew about Jeb Hawkes somehow. And the only hint of how that could have happened was Quentin, when he gets his memory back and he meets Jeb Hawkes, he says something, I have a strange feeling we've met before. The only place I could have met you was a place I've never been, and that's hell.
Oh, interesting.
Now, we have this weird parallel story because of the way Barnabas changed history. Some weird things happen with timelines.
Yes.
They sort of combined. So to most of the people living in Collinwood, they remember Quentin as a ghost, and then it ended abruptly when David died and then came back to life, and Quentin stopped being a ghost. But Quentin seemed to be living in an older timeline where he just remained an immortal because of the portrait, and then pops up at Collinwood. So he would have been in hell in the original timeline when he was a ghost. So he must have memories of that or something.
Well, we know Jeb had previous incarnations at some point, because in the 18th century, we have that whole storyline about Peter Bradford's ghost seeking vengeance on Jeb, because, as we find out, Jeb caused Victoria Winters to fall off Widow's Hill. So, which was quite shocking. I remember when I watched that at the time, it was like, whoa, Vicky died off screen. Oh no, what's going on here? And initially it seemed that Jeb was this formless being that came into existence we find out he did take human form at some point in the past, because he recognizes Peter Bradford. He is terrified. So it's interesting. We have the ghosts of their victims can come back to get vengeance on them, and also the werewolves, their ancient enemies, the werewolves. Now, I always felt that when I first saw that too, if they're from time before humanity, how can there be werewolves? But I assume at that point, maybe the concept of a werewolf was more of a spirit creature. Like if there was no human to turn into, there's no were part of the werewolf. It's what, so just kind of trying to wrap my head. I like trying to figure out how that works. Do you guys have any theories on that?
If they're borrowing from Robert E. Howard, he had werewolves in a story called Wolf's Head, which is sort of shares the same mythology, the Shadow Kingdom. There is some discussion of this war between humanity and monster races.
Right, yeah.
And werewolves start up as pure evil spirits that are wolf.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
And then they possess a human host.
I see.
And kind of merge with it.
Yeah, and I assume it was something similar there then, that they were pulling from that concept. Mark, what are your thoughts on this whole thing with Jeb having a prior incarnation in the 18th century and the whole Victoria Winters angle? What were your feelings on that?
Well, it felt like, of course, as a kid, I didn't notice that much. In later years, when I've probably watched the entire series through about 4 times and then assorted parts of it, more than that. And I suppose it's a little bit cynical, but as the more times I've seen that part of the story, I can't help but get the feeling, okay, the writers keep painting themselves into a corner, so they have to fall back onto something that the audience is going to better identify with. And so hence, to my mind, the great old ones who were, was, were, and ever shall be and all that, suddenly we've got it sort of being conflated with the more traditional religious depiction and, the hellish entity. Now, I will say I appreciated the fact they brought Nicholas Blair into it, simply because I think Humbert Allen Ostredo is just so eminently watchable. You can't you can't not love him as a villain. So whatever mechanism they used to bring him in there, I was jumping up and down going, yeah, this was great. So at some point, I stopped thinking as much about the logic or the strange continuities that were resulting from all this, and sort of seeing it more of just sort of, we've gone from this one experience and we're going to twist things around a little bit plot-wise. And what came to me later, not during the Leviathans period, but once they started getting into the parallel time, which came shortly after, and I began thinking, with the whole parallel time thing and events changing in the past, what I see here is a weird merging of dimensions, and sometimes it causes chaos. And and I'm convinced that the state of our country today is because they turned on that goddamn Hadron Collider, and it halfway merged the bizarro world with our normal world, and now we've just got 7 levels of hell all around us every day. So
we have officially entered the parallel time.
I feel like that. Or pockets. I feel like there are pockets.
The dystopian.
And I realize I'm being facetious here, but at the same time, I'm thinking maybe there are actually pockets where things aren't the same here as they are up there. Are you a fan of Twin Peaks?
I am familiar with it. I've watched some of it. I haven't.
There's weird especially in that last season of Twin Peaks. There's this whole Lynchian shattering of normal perception of time and space. And I feel like, having become such a big fan of David Lynch, I can almost apply some of this Lynchian philosophy or outlook to the things that happen in the plot lines of Dark Shadows, and I credit it to this fragmenting of time.
I agree with you. I mean, and I've said this before on the podcast too, there is so much tampering with the timeline in Dark Shadows, starting with, if we go back to 1840 with Quentin's stairway through time, Quentin the First building a stairway through time, making this metaphysical experiment, this talisman that he creates to travel through time. We have the seance with Victoria Winters. We have Barnabas using I Ching and Julia using I Ching to go back and forth in time. Somehow a tear opens into a parallel universe in the East Wing of Collinwood, probably because of all of this other stuff that's going on and tampering with time over and over again. I always felt they should have addressed that. Like there's some cataclysm that's imminent because of all the tampering with the time stream. And that's how I explain all the inconsistent dates, like 1795, 1797. Like, why is it 1797 now? It's because of what you just said. Things are bleeding over from other timelines, and time travel is screwing up the timeline. My friend Eric also put out the theory that, or the Collins estate, that's enchanted ground from the curse.
I can absolutely get on board with that idea. And in my younger days, I kept trying to find logical segues from one character or plot arc or whatever, because it almost seems so often that, what is a fact at this point, it gets rendered essentially invalid a few episodes down the road. And clearly, I think the writers only had limited time, limited resources to go back and reconstruct everything that had come before. And they thought, well, nobody's ever going to see this again, so who's going to care? And I think a lot of the inconsistencies and the gaffes and just the directions that things went go to budget constraints, just the schedules, all kinds of stuff. But I do love and find it fascinating to try to untangle the knots and then retie them in some sort of orderly braid,
Agreed. That's why I love having writers on the show, because that's the mindset. It's like, how does this puzzle work? Like, how do I make these ideas work in a story? And it's fascinating to try to play that game and try to figure out.
When I was writing, and not so much Dreams of the Dark, it was more of a straightforward story that's kind of inserted into a timeline. But when I started writing The Path of Fate for Big Finish, and then especially Curse of the Pharaoh, I lost sleep trying to figure out, okay, we've got this thread. How can I work that in there? And I want to go with, like the stairway through time. How can I make that work with the world I'm trying to construct here?
Yeah.
And oh boy, that kept me awake a lot.
I loved those audio dramas, especially Path of Fate. I love Path of Fate. And I even shared it with, there was a friend of mine he was a huge Doctor Who fan, but he also was getting into Dark Shadows, and he wanted to listen to some of the audio dramas. And I handed him Kingdom of the Dead, which I love too, and Path of Fate. And he loved it. The Dagon inclusion and some of the Lovecraftian stuff you worked into that. Is the sort of...
and this is a complete aside, and sorry if I'm getting off track, but when I listened to Path of Fate for the first time, and the fact that Laura and David were so good, I forgot I wrote it. I freaking forgot I wrote it. I'm like, I don't even know what happened.
No, it was scary. It had a wonderful horror vibe, as it should. I loved that. And David and Laura.
End of that, when Laura goes off into the classic Angelique laugh, I was in tears. I was actually in freaking tears.
Oh, that's great. She is just sensational. And another great segue, because as I mentioned, we have Angelique back in the present day, which is awesome, because we have Barnabas back to being a vampire, because Barnabas, we get this episode where the writers kind of course corrected with Barnabas, because the audience was upset that Barnabas had been taken over by the Leviathans. So we have this whole storyline where Michael commands Barnabas to kill Julia Hoffman, and this precipitates Barnabas's turn away from the Leviathans as he starts to shake free of their control. And we find out also that they're threatening to turn him back into a vampire. We get Marsha Mason as a one episode vampire appearance. Yeah. And we find out they tell him that Josette is being held hostage. History has changed here too, because Josette ends up committing suicide by taking poison this time instead of jumping off Widow's Hill. So now that one is tough for me to swallow, because that's such a key component of the show for all those years, that Josette committed suicide by falling off Widow's Hill, and the whole story with Josette and Barnabas and Angelique. And now history has apparently been changed because Josette took poison instead, because Barnabas never showed up. He was taken by the Leviathans. I like to think that history somehow reasserted itself, and Josette did end up falling off Widow's Hill somehow.
I always think that way. Yeah, that somewhere in all that story, the real history reasserts.
Yes, it kind of has to. I mean, that's such a key thing. So Barnabas shakes free of the Leviathan influence, and he is punished by Jeb Hawks, who Roger Collins calls a cheap, insufferable pig, which is one of my favorite lines. Barnabas is back to being a vampire. And of course, this turns out to be a really bad move for Jeb, who is extremely impulsive and does whatever he wants and creates an extremely powerful supernatural enemy in turning Barnabas back into a vampire. Now you have Barnabas running around. He sets the antique shop on fire. He turns Megan Todd into a vampire, and she's fantastic. Marie Wallace as a vampire, just incredible. She preys on Philip. I mean, there's so much fun stuff that Willie Loomis comes back to guard Barnabas. He says he's engaged to this woman, Roxanne, who we never meet. And it isn't the same Roxanne we meet as a vampire later. It's a different Roxanne. Presumably, there's no indication of otherwise. I think it's a coincidence. But, Willie initially doesn't want to do this, but he actually voluntarily comes back and to guard Barnabas during the day. And Willie and Julia are the ones who track Megan Todd down eventually and drive a stake through her heart. And then we have the whole subplot with Paul Stoddard and Carolyn, and how initially, there's a lot of damage that was done there, but they grow close, and we find out more about, Paul has changed over the years, and he wants to be close with Carolyn again. And there's a great scene where Elizabeth and Paul confront each other. Oh my goodness. And Paul ends up back at Collinwood. There's a flashback to 1949 where we find out that Paul made a bargain with the Leviathans, with Mr. Strack, and he promised his most valuable possession to the Leviathans, and in return they would bring him success. And so it was Carolyn, of course, and Carolyn is destined to be the bride of their messiah, Jeb Hawks. Well, of course, as mentioned, Jeb is extremely impulsive and sees Paul Stoddard as an enemy, and he takes on his true form and kills Paul Stoddard, which was against the Leviathan plan. Jeb didn't care about what the book said. Jeb did his own thing. Paul was supposed to give Carolyn away during the ceremony, so that's not going to happen. But Carolyn starts having these dreams wherein Jeb's hands are covered in blood. In the corners of her unconscious mind, we're finding that she never uncovers the truth that Jeb killed her father. I mean, we see later on during the summer 1970 haunting storyline that she's still grieving for the loss of Jeb. And it would have been interesting to see how she would have reacted to that knowledge. She was putting the pieces together in her sleep. But those dream sequences were really cool. Really lots of fun things happening. You get a scene with Willie and Maggie Evans with the Leviathan creature approaching to attack them, because the Leviathan sets its sights on Maggie Evans as well as an enemy. And there's a great scene where Jeb tries to convert Maggie to bring her under the Leviathan's sway, and it doesn't work, but she pretends that it does. There's some really fun stuff. Julia finds Angelique, actually, and despite Angelique asking her not to say anything, because Angelique doesn't want anything to do with Collinwood or the people at Collinwood anymore, but Julia does tell Barnabas that Angelique is on Little Windward Island. So then Barnabas also goes to Angelique, and there are some great scenes with Barnabas and Angelique that take place, and Julia and Angelique as well. Angelique has renounced her powers. Well, she still has her powers, but she has agreed she's not using them. Another bargain with the devil, that she's fallen in love with Sky Rumson, who is such a garbage character. It's so satisfying when Barnabas kills Sky Rumson. Spoiler. Yes. I put a spoiler tag at the beginning of the show. Sky, as it turns out, has made a bargain with Nicholas Blair and is in league with the Leviathans. And there's a great scene where Nicholas and Angelique see each other for the first time since 1968. The looks on both of their faces when they see each other are just priceless. And then I love it when
best lines in Dark Shadows.
Yes.
So when Humbert Allen Estrado says, at the risk of sounding banal, small world.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. That was great. So he makes Sky Rumson choose between Angelique and the Leviathans, and Sky chooses the Leviathans and tries to put the torch to Angelique, tries to burn her, and she stops him. She uses her favorite trick, the poppet there. She chokes grabs a statue and starts choking him with his scarf. And she's, in full possession of her powers and goes on to assist against the Leviathans. But then, of course, Barnabas has set his sights on Maggie now that he's a vampire again. So Angelique puts a love spell on Quentin and has him and Mag. They start this whole storyline with they even bring back the brand, the pitchfork on the hand, which was really cool to see that come back. She eventually puts a shadow curse on Jeb, which I think that must come from M.R. James from casting the runes. I think that's a loose, steal from M.R. James because it's not exactly the same, but there are echoes of M.R. James of casting the runes or Curse of the Demon, the film adaptation, or Night of the Demon.
My absolute favorite horror movie.
Is it really? Why so?
It is. There is something about, first of all, I saw the image of the demon. I believe it was on the cover of Famous Monsters of Filmland long before I ever saw that movie. And that, I was a kid. I saw that thing, it scared the hell out of me. And I saw the movie when I was a teenager, and the drama of it was so engaging. The characters, and I mean, they show you up front that this creature, the thing out of hell, it's real, and yet the logic, the conflict between logic and faith moves so heavily toward logic. It's like, did we really see that? Did we really see that? And then you saw it. And I just love the structure of that movie, the music, the acting. It's a freaking classic.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
Much better than the original story, I would say.
I agree, actually. I like the story, too. I enjoyed the story.
I like it.
Yeah. But it's the movies. Yeah, it's definitely a classic. I think that the shadow creature, this demon or whatever that is, she sends after Jeb. I think that, and then she tells him how to, he sort of comes to the realization that he genuinely loves Carolyn and doesn't want, and she's terrified by his true form. She sees his true form and she sees this creature. She's terrified. So Jeb now wants Julia to cure him, which is insane. That is such a bananas idea because he is that creature. That is what he is, so how can she cure him of it? I mean, she's willing to give it a shot because he basically forces her to do this. He finally teams up with Barnabas and destroys the Naga box and uses that great devil-headed cane that Nicholas Blair has to smash the scepter, to smash the box. The altar crumbles, falls apart, and now somehow, just through sheer force of will, Jeb Hawks, I think Dominique Lamsey is who I had on the show before, calls him a bratty elder god, which I love that description for the bratty elder god, Jabez Hawks. And he marries Carolyn. She becomes Carolyn Stoddard Hawks. They get married, but he's pursued by this shadow until finally he tries to connect with Angelique because she loves Barnabas, and he kind of uses, don't you know what it's like to be in love with someone, and that kind of thing. And she tells him he can pass the curse on to someone else, which he puts the shadow on Nicholas. Now, I've had discussions on this podcast. I've asked several guests, do you think Nicholas Blair is a demon or a warlock? And I think this storyline kind of almost cements that he must be a very powerful warlock because he dies. The shadow kills Nicholas Blair. It consumes him. But then you see his ghost rise from his body. So if he has a spirit, if he has a ghost, then he must, I assumed if he was a demon, he would have no spirit. That would just be him But if he is a warlock, then he has a damned soul, right? I don't know. What do you guys think about all that?
I think he was a human being
at one point. What about you, Mark?
I think, he probably was your, I hesitate to use the word normal, but, a human who evolved to some other state, a higher state, but was still at his core a human being.
That's the question that I pose is, to me, a demon was never human. It was just it was a being that was, whatever, a fallen angel or whatever you want to call it, or a creature from the underworld. But Nicholas, I think, like Angelique, I think must have started as a human. But they imply, I think maybe initially when they introduced him in 1968, there's an implication that he's a demon because he talks about the pact that Cassandra has with him and all of this kind of thing. So maybe he was just put in charge of the coven.
I see him as kind of having power by proxy there. Maybe, he's given or donated abilities and powers by whatever entity or force is directly above him.
Mm-hmm. That must be how, just that sequence where his spirit rises up and then he sends Sky to go take care of business. I think that definitely kind of cements it for me when I saw that. Other things that were happening in this storyline, in addition to sort of the core story with Jeb and Carolyn here going on and Barnabas, we also have the other components here. We have Bruno came in, as you mentioned, and he's Jeb's right-hand man. He's this psycho guy in a fur coat. And he's after Chris Jennings because the werewolf poses a threat to Jeb. So we have the Chris Jennings storyline continuing into the Leviathan storyline.
And the fact that they made Quentin immortal enabled the writers to put Chris Jennings and Quentin Collins, his great-grandfather, together in a couple of scenes. And there was one great scene where I think Chris wanted Quentin to shoot him with a silver bullet, or wanted him to destroy him, and Quentin refused. And Chris, basically said, "Hey, I'm like this because of you, so you owe me at least this." It was really great that they were able to do that.
And I love that the werewolf was part of that storyline. And I think at that point, too, they had evolved the makeup quite a bit. Alex Stevens in the werewolf makeup. And it was just cool, like that whole sequence with the zombie Sheriff Davenport, whose name on his grave is and his gravestone is Sheriff Davenport. I remember seeing all these theories about why would they put Sheriff Davenport on? Couldn't they give the guy a first name? Maybe somebody said maybe his first name is Sheriff.
Yes, Sheriff.
Maybe it's such an honor to be the sheriff of Collinsport that you get your title instead of your first name on your gravestone. But the zombie sheriff and the werewolf chained up in the mausoleum, and Bruno with the whip with the silver. It was off. Bruno was horrible to the you feel sympathy for you will feel sympathy for Chris Jennings because he's the Larry Talbot of the show. He's the Wolfman character. He's the cursed werewolf through no fault of his own.
And in fact, we even hear the poem from the Wolfman. Actually, it's the version from Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. That's invoked a couple of times during this storyline, and it's presented as an old piece of folklore, this old poem, but it actually was created by Kurt Siodmak in the screenplay for The Wolfman. And the Wolfman version is slightly different from the one you hear in Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. In The Wolfman, it's even a man who's pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. But in Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, it's slightly altered. And there it's even a man who's pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright. So it's full and bright now. The full moon isn't referenced in the original Wolfman. It's later on that's incorporated into those films. Again, this is another thing that was created in werewolf mythology by Kurt Siodmak, as he did many things. The Silver Bullet actually predates the Wolfman, though, and he worked that in, but a lot of the other things are actually new constructions by Kurt Siodmak that found their way into Dark Shadows, and the full and bright version of that poem finds its way a couple of times into Dark Shadows. But back to the storyline, we start to feel for the werewolf, because Chris Jennings is generally a pretty nice guy, but suffers from this terrible curse. With the werewolf, this frenzied force of destruction that just kills whatever it sees, anybody it sees. But now you feel bad for the werewolf itself, because Bruno is so awful to the werewolf that you kind of, again, it's kind of satisfying when Bruno gets his comeuppance and it's the werewolf who does him in. I love that you see Quentin, and because of course we find out Chris Jennings and Amy are both members of the Collins family. They're descendants of Quentin Collins, and thus why Chris Jennings is a werewolf. So what did you think about all that, the werewolf aspect?
I loved it.
Yeah.
And one thing that was, you mentioned the sheriff before. The writers later forgot this. They had this idea that anybody who Jeff Hawks kills, he can bring back to life.
Yes.
And later they have him create a whole zombie army just by calling out Satan. So they threw that out. But that was sort of from Robert E. Howard's The Shadow Kingdom, where the serpent men of Valusia could control the ghost of anybody he killed, which was one of their powers, which becomes a weakness for the Leviathans.
With the ghosts, yeah. But they can still bring back zombies.
Yeah, but the writers, it would have been, if they had continued on that line, Jeb should have been able to bring Paul Stoddard back to life.
Oh, yeah, true. Good point. And
now, when Dennis Patrick left the show unexpectedly.
Yes, yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was some theory that when we first had that ghost haunting Jeb, it was going to be Paul.
Right.
And initially it was, and he burns the body and whatever. It was still going to be Paul. Then they made it
Peter Bradford, yeah.
Peter Bradford, I was going to say Jeff Clark, but it was sort of the same person.
Yeah. Oh, Jeff Clark, speaking of, you reminded me, Charles Delaware Tate is still around too. He's this really old man who's super eccentric and lives in the, they track him down, and they try to get him to paint a painting of Chris Jennings to cure him of the werewolf curse. Of course, that doesn't work. And he's also dispatched by the werewolf. But it was interesting seeing an old Charles, and there's sort of that weird Charles Delaware Tate, this mannequin of Charles Delaware Tate, or I don't even, some kind of automaton that his head falls off.
His head falls off.
Yeah. There's a story that Roger Davis, that's one of the rare instances, I guess, where they had to reshoot it because he couldn't stop laughing, I guess, because the head falling off and rolling across the floor. Mark, what were your thoughts on the whole werewolf angle as part of this storyline?
Well, to be honest, it seemed like too convenient a device to bring back the familiar into a story that was kind of going off the rails at the time. I loved what Rick said about pulling the Robert E. Howard idea into it and looking at it as something in that regard.
Yeah.
Because that elevates the werewolf itself into something more than a physical curse of just turning a human into a monstrous thing. It takes the origin of the werewolf back into something far more, not just supernatural, but
primordial,
something eldritch. Something
eldritch.
Way beyond it. And it's only hearing Rick say that makes me think, well, maybe it wasn't that goofy after all. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that must have been if the Leviathans existed during a time before humans, before there was even shape in the werewolf must have been some evil spirit at that point in existence. So yeah, I like that too. They also pulled in Werewolf of London, the Henry Hull film with Sabrina, because Sabrina, who had been catatonic and white-haired, was the first person who ever saw Chris transform into a werewolf. She recovers. She's, slowly she comes back. She reconnects with Chris Jennings, and she brings him the moon poppy, which of course is the analog for the mariphasia, from the Werewolf of London, which was an interesting, because everybody thinks of the Wolfman, but that was actually, predates the Wolfman too. So that was cool. that's the last we see too of Chris, Sabrina, and Amy Jennings, at least insofar as the main time band is concerned. Because when they come back to the present day after parallel time in 1995, they have left Collinsport to try to find a cure for Chris's condition. So poor Chris Jennings never gets his cure, probably with a silver bullet. Interestingly, they do bring up this idea that because Bruno wants to kill Chris Jennings while he's in human form, and Jeb Hawks makes the remark, you can't do that, because if you kill him while he's in human form, it will turn him into the animal forever, which maybe lends more credence again to this whole idea of this primordial wolf, evil wolf spirit.
That's in Robert E. Howard too.
Is it really?
Is something that you can't kill a werewolf. I think it's a little different. You can't kill a werewolf while he's human. Otherwise, the spirit will go from that human host to you.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I bet they were. I mean, you mentioned this in your art. I'd forgotten you mentioned when I had Andrew Higgins on here, Dr. Andrew Higgins, in a recent episode. He sent me Seabury Quinn's The Door Without a Key. But you mentioned that in your article too, with regard to that being the inspiration for the use of I Ching on Dark Shadows. So they were definitely not only looking at Gothic literature from the 18th and 19th centuries. They were also looking at pulp stories clearly and pulling, besides Lovecraft, but they were pulling stuff from Robert E. Howard, from Seabury Quinn, and others as well.
And that Seabury Quinn story had never been reprinted. Mm-hmm. So whoever got that idea read the original Weird Tales.
Yeah, they must have been reading Weird Tales. Well, I knew Dan Curtis was a fan of horror stories. So, but they also, I mean, I'm sure there's a story that he hired a speed reader to read horror stories and summarize them. There's another story about a Rolodex of horror that had all the I wish I could have been there to see where were all these stories coming from? Like how did they get their hands on that Weird Tales issue?
Back in that period, the typical werewolf model was, your standard, the Wolfman, the Lon Chaney, and that sort of the very anthropomorphic design. And I've always wished, and of course it's impractical, but wouldn't it have been cool if you could have designed, Quentin and Chris Jennings' werewolf to look something like the critters out of The Howling, because those were impressive, frightening, horrifying werewolves. And then you could have convinced me that maybe that would have scared Leviathans.
I always loved the more traditional looking Wolfman style of the werewolf, but I know what you're saying, like this extremely powerful entity that their true forms.
Well, just so much more animalistic and yet still far more sentient. Combining the strength of both the animal and the human in this massively powerful being. Then and like I said, that was way beyond the scope of Dark Shadows, but in my mind's eye, I've tried to put things together that way. I mean, I love the Lon Chaney Wolfman. In fact, of all the Universal monsters, the Wolfman is that and Creature from the Black Lagoon are my favorite. But I mean, the makeup and the personality that shows through in that critter, man, I love it. I absolutely love it. But from the standpoint of sheer power, something that would intimidate a Leviathan, visually these things don't translate well in my brain.
I do love the scene where the werewolf jumps through the window of the old house and attacks, makes a beeline straight for Jeb Hawks on the and then luckily, for Jeb, I guess the sun comes up and the werewolf is racked with pain and changes back into Chris Jennings. I thought that was a great scene there. I want to talk a little bit about the Quentin and Amanda thing in just a second, but what did you guys think about Jeb as a character, Chris Pennock's Jeb Hawks, this new actor who's brought into the show, very different from any other actor we've had on the show, the late Chris Pennock, who there was something really crazed, I think, about Chris Pennock sometimes that was fun to watch, but definitely brought a whole different vibe, I think, to Dark Shadows. What did you guys think of him?
I really got to appreciate it as time went by. I also liked him when he was John Yeager.
John Yeager. Oh, gosh, he was just vile. The hide.
And also, he just looked very strong
I wonder if they put padding in his shoulders even when he had that overcoat on as Jaeger, because he just looked very broad-shouldered. Yeah.
I was glad they got rid of the fake nose real quick.
Oh, me too. Yeah, that only lasted a couple episodes, but that was strange. Yeah.
But Chris was so freaking good in that. And yeah, I think he presented the human form of a Leviathan. He presented a barely restrained madness, and sometimes not that restrained. And I feel like that's exactly what would really be if you've got this power manipulating a human form, restraining itself, but only just. And I think that too is also why I was kind of disappointed when he started getting softer and falling in love with Carolyn, because it's like, no, you can't take that power and soften it to by human emotion. It didn't work for me so well. And again, jumping ahead, that's what I started to play with that a bit in Curse of the Pharaoh to sort of bridge that gap between the horror and the human there.
And I want to talk about that. I want to get to, the influence of Dark Shadows on your work and how you played in that world and in that sandbox. For sure, I want to get to that. The last thing I want to talk about, though, with regard to this storyline, before we move on to that, is we also have the other subplot that takes place during the Leviathan storyline is the Quentin and Olivia Corey storyline. And we've met the devil in Dark Shadows, Diabolos. Now we get to meet the embodiment of death, who is not what you would expect, I guess, on Dark Shadows. Mr. Best. Mr. Best, the well-mannered, genteel Mr. Best. He was really fun. Emery Bass played him. Mm-hmm. He was interesting, I thought. It was an interesting depiction of death, who has come for Olivia, aka Amanda Harris. Amanda Harris is a construct. She came to life. She was Charles Delaware Tate's painting who came to life, and she was supposed to have died in the 19th century when she killed herself. And Mr. Best let her live on, but finally her time has come right when she finds Quentin again. So what did you think of this whole thing? And then they end up, of course, doing this whole Orpheus and Eurydice thing from Greek mythology.
I recognized I was a teenager, but I had read Greek mythology. I recognized the Orpheus connection. The whole thing with Mr. Best and the hotel was reminding me of the Twilight Zone.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I could see that.
They had done a lot of things with the afterlife and death. Like they had the one where a peddler had to prevent death from killing this young boy. And we had seen Robert Redford as death in another episode. So I was used to personification of death. I just didn't expect to see that type of story on Dark Shadows.
Right. It was different for Dark Shadows. With Dark Shadows, you almost expect to see the Grim Reaper type of character. But yeah, it is more like a Twilight Zone depiction of death in Mr. Best.
And then we get this infusion of Greek mythology, which is also unusual for Dark Shadows, although not a first for Dark Shadows, because they did do a riff on Pygmalion with Amanda Harris and Charles Delaware Tate. They kind of took a page from that, and there's a reference to Cerberus on the pentagram that was buried with Quentin's son. May this protect you from the wrath of Cerberus, which of course is the multi-headed dog that guards the gates of the underworld. So they were occasionally they would drop Greek mythology in there. Sometimes they drop Egyptian mythology in there as well. But this is definitely straight out of Orpheus and Eurydice.
The whole underworld, like trying to get out of the underworld, they can't touch each other, and basically ends the same way for Amanda Harris.
They drop a ton of earth on her.
Oh, yes. Yeah. She said it went up in her nostrils and her shit in her mouth and all that. Yeah.
Because I expected that they were just going to, when that was going to happen, I thought it was going to be something like a disappearance.
Yeah.
That it would be that chroma key effect. And
they dropped it. And then they moved on to the next scene and left her under all of that.
Yeah.
She tells the story that it just was buried under all this dirt. And then they just went off to shoot the next scene and just kind of left her there. Mark, what did you think of this Greek mythology being infused into Dark Shadows and Mr. Best?
It has now been so long since I've seen any of those particular episodes. They're a little bit, they're hazier in my mind than, a lot of the key stuff we've been talking about. But my recollection, looking back, was actually thinking, Mr. Best, he's got a sinister air about him, but you know what? If I've got to go, I want to talk to Mr. Best. Not the Grim Reaper.
Yes,
but then again, and then I think, well, maybe not, because you may remember a line from Curse of the Demon when Kumar says the devil is most dangerous when he's being pleasant.
Oh, yeah.
And and when I think back on that, I remember thinking Mr. Best was, different within the context of Dark Shadows, creepy because he was charming. And then Amanda's end, I remember feeling a little bit sorrowful because I felt like she was, like you said, she was not born. Not in the way of, your typical human. She came from a piece of art. So did she have a soul? Did she have true memories? Were they constructed memories? My thoughts in that always were, what was she really? What did she have inside her?
Yeah.
Because that's left unanswered.
So what did she have inside her? That's a good question. Does she have a soul? Presumably, if Mr. Best is bringing her to the land of the dead or wherever.
Yeah, you would assume so.
She must. I mean, that process, that magical process, he must have imbued her with, maybe it's not the same as a human soul, but it's some essence, some sentient that she has. So.
Yeah, I always found Charles Delaware Tate as a medium for channeling power.
Interesting.
To and from art. And to actually be able to, it was one thing to me to make a painting, in the Oscar Wilde mode, but to create life, taking that next step. And I think like I said, it's been a long time since I've seen those episodes, but my impression from when I did see them was all about what was this person that was created, what's fabricated in her mind, or were memories artificially given to her, or was she actually somehow born? She must have had a life cycle just like any other human being.
I mean, he was able to resurrect Garth Blackwood, who clearly had memories of who Aristide was. I mean, he was dead set on getting Aristide. So he remembered Aristide. So, I mean, he must have been conjured up from hell or wherever when the painting was created. So there's more to it than just this image that's now alive. There's more to this. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
The soul or the personality and the essence of that person comes from somewhere.
Yeah. In Quentin's case, the soul is the painting. The painting is in the Dorian Gray mode. His painting, which we finally get to see all of the age and all the sins that, the awful things, the damage he's been through some stuff there. Quentin has clearly. One thing I would have liked to have seen, though, is we know the painting transforms during the full moon instead of Quentin. So what does the old werewolf look like? What does the 1970 werewolf look like in that painting? That would have been fun to see, I think.
Yeah. I won't go into it because, again, I don't want to sidetrack, but in the unpublished Labyrinth of Souls, the painting, what's left of it is at that point in time basically unrecognizable. And that's sort of the conflict about what happens in that story, is because does the painting have a lifespan?
Yeah. Will it rot away eventually? Yes. Yeah. And that fans can read. Like I said, I'm going to post a link to that in the show notes when I post this episode.
I'll make sure I think it's still up there. I haven't.
It is.
All the files are there. I know all the files are there, but I don't know that I've still got the link on my site like I used to. I'll have to check that out. But it should, if you've got the link, it should work.
Yeah. The Leviathan storyline they were writing House of Dark Shadows while the Leviathan storyline was going on, and they were gearing up for House of Dark Shadows. And because most of the main cast members, Joan Bennett and Jonathan Frid, Grayson Hall, Thayer David, etc. Who did Thayer David, Professor Stokes? He was also an ally against the Leviathans, but he didn't show up enough. Like, he did a couple of things, but he must have been busy during that time because we didn't see as much of Professor Stokes, I think, as I would have.
It looks like they were going to develop Stokes more until they decided to make that special Rush episode. Barnabas suddenly becomes sympathetic.
Right.
Because if you look back, he finally pays a visit to the antique shop. And something's going on in his mind every time he sees these serpent jewelry.
Yes.
A couple who, Megan and her husband. And I was expecting an episode where he's going to pull out one of his books and go to Julia. This is an ancient race called the Leviathans.
Yes, right.
And be the equivalent of when somebody in a Lovecraft story picks up the Necronomicon to explain everything that's going on.
Yeah, he is the Professor Armitage. I always call him the Van Helsing, but he's also the Professor Armitage sort of character in Dark Shadows who would figure that out and say, that these are the Leviathans, ancient race of beings, blah, blah, blah.
And then be instrumental in helping to defeat them.
But yeah, they kind of dropped that. That didn't happen.
It doesn't pop up till parallel time to explain the room.
Yes, and that's where the Leviathans ends. Jeb Hawks is killed by Sky Rumson. He's pushed off Widow's Hill because we find out that you can drown the Leviathans. I guess they can't swim. They're not good swimmers. So Jeb goes off Widow's Hill like he did with Peter Bradford. He killed Jeb that way too.
I don't know if water was a weakness of the Leviathans or just of Jeb.
Oh yeah, maybe so. Maybe it was just Jeb specifically.
I get the impression it was only Jeb.
Maybe the Messiah of the Leviathans is the one who he has that weakness, or he's can be drowned. So he's destroyed that way. Carolyn is a widow. And while this was going on, Barnabas, they discovered this room, and Barnabas discovers this room that leads to an alternate band of time, a parallel universe. And he is determined to enter parallel because he thinks he can escape the vampire curse that Jeb has put on him, which is interesting logic. Maybe in this universe, I won't be a vampire, but he makes it into parallel time. And I will leave it there with that, with the Leviathans. But I do want to ask you guys this. A lot of fans to this day say that they don't like the Leviathan storyline. There are a lot of fans who I think it almost has a cult following to it in comparison to like the really popular storylines. The people who like Leviathans really like it, but a lot of fans really dislike the Leviathan storyline. So what would you guys say to fans who maybe dislike the Leviathans? What would you say in its defense that they maybe should give it another look?
It is confusing at times, but remember that when you initially saw Quentin Collins, and if you didn't know the turn of the screw, you were wondering what the heck was going on with that one too. And we came to appreciate it because it evolved into the best storyline of Dark Shadows in 1897. And unfortunately, they had a plan to spin off, not parallel time. It was going to be the return of Victoria Winters. And we see that was all the machinations involving Peter Bradford and his ghost. And if they had been able to get Alexandra Moki to come back as Victoria Winters, we would have had a very fascinating offshoot of the Leviathans that would, I think, have been superior to the parallel time storyline.
Mark, what about you?
Sorry. Rick just said about Alexander, yeah, that opens all kinds of new doors in some other. That would have to be parallel time to make that happen. But I completely understand the dislike for the Leviathans. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with the entire that storyline. And my fondness for it is largely rooted in nostalgia, because truly that was when I first got to watch Dark Shadows full time after only seeing it sporadically for, however many times I was able to see it before then. And yet, when the Leviathan storyline is good, when it goes to that sort of sense of terror of the unknown, it's unparalleled. I mean, that thing behind the door in the antique shop, the expertise of these child actors to convey that stuff was, to my mind, very objectively good. That stuff was very, very strong. The problem I have is that as the storyline went along, it became muddled. It became divided between one set of criteria and another. And it started to collapse under its own weight of not knowing where it was going to go. And again, hence why I decided to revisit it for Curse of the Pharaoh, because I felt like we had such a strong foundation that ultimately didn't go, or the storyline didn't go where I think people wanted it to, or where it should have from a dramatic standpoint. So like I said, I understand the dislike for it, but I feel like its roots, its heart, at least it started out in the right place. It presented some of the strongest moments of fear in the entire series. There was some great acting in there. I mean, especially those kids. Chris Pennock, when he was at his most dangerous, he really shone. And then he got a chance in, when we got to the Cyrus Longworth, John Yeager story, that's where we really got to see Chris really shine as an actor. So that sort of eased him into the series as a whole. So yeah, Leviathans is a mixed bag. And I love it for what it did for me, drawing me into Dark Shadow's heart and soul.
Yeah, it's a deeply weird storyline. It's a flawed storyline. It's flawed, but it's weird and cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned Curse of the Pharaoh, Mark. How did Dark Shadows inform your work? And I was going to say, specifically, it seems like the Leviathans work their way into your stories, at least with Curse of the Pharaoh and Path of Fate. Is there any sort of influence or inspiration when you're working on Dark Shadows or non-Dark Shadows projects as well?
Dark Shadows has always been a centerpiece of my universe, my fictional universe. Almost everything I write, it's as whether it's tied in, not tied in, if I have a little Easter egg, so to speak, here and there. I've approached an awful lot of fiction that I write as if Dark Shadows was the Bible, as if or portions of Dark Shadows anyway, that the Lovecraft mythos was all there. Even in my most non-Dark Shadows excursions into fiction, my World War II novel, Blue Devil Island, it's got sort of a Lovecraftian basis to it. The one tribute to Dark Shadows that I put in there was a pilot named Max Collins. And if you look at the description of the character, it's freaking Quentin.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And I've done that in other stories and books where I will just sort of drop a little Easter egg, to say, what if this really is tied into Dark Shadows as if that universe exists somewhere beyond the confines of what I'm writing. As far as my direct Dark Shadows stuff, the novel that Beth Massey and I did, Dreams of the Dark, we decided to sort of, we didn't consider it parallel time per se, but we wanted to expand the horizons of the world of Dark Shadows as it was portrayed in the show. We felt like, okay, between these episodes, there is room for more things to happen. So we opened up this space in the storyline after Victoria has returned from the past, from 1795, introduced a new vampire, interacted with the Collins family as they were in the series at that time, and told a new story, and then closed it up so that then the events of the show can continue right where the end of Dreams of the Dark leaves off. Now, the big finish stories, Path of Fate, Curse of the Pharaoh, and Blood Dance, the Path of Fate and Curse of the Pharaoh are set just whenever you can fit them in, like in the 70s, sometime in the 70s. They might logically follow events that the show set up. And with Curse of the Pharaoh, I introduced a new character, what was her name? Gretchen Warwick, that Marie Wallace played in the drama.
Yes.
To indicate that the Leviathans weren't gone. They may have had to move around to get past what happened in the show, but it was a vehicle for me to sort of revisit Jeb and Caroline and try to make some sense out of why a Leviathan being would transform, where the human construct would overshadow the otherworldly being. And so I don't know that it worked out perfectly, not by any stretch, but I wanted to at least explore the possibilities, to go back in time, to tie some of that Egyptian lore and make that more pronounced, and to tie it more directly into Lovecraft, and not just Lovecraft, but other writers who contributed to the Cthulhu mythos, and bring in the pharaoh Nephren-Ka.
Yes, I was going to say, yeah.
Very, very distinctly from the Lovecraftian universe.
Yeah.
So to tie that in there, make it firm that Leviathans and the great old ones, if not one and the same, are quite related. And then sort of polish up that stuff that went on with Carolyn and Jeb. Now, and here again, I'm going to go back what I said before. It's been a long time since I've done a lot of this stuff. To even remember what the hell Curse of the Pharaoh was about, I had to go back to the Wikipedia and read. Because, I've written hundreds of things since I've written that. And I don't revisit what I've written in the past very often. I because usually I hate it. And so I listened to Curse of the Pharaoh once it came out, once Big Finish put it out. Then I was moving on to the next thing. And then I moved on to the next thing. And I moved on to the next thing. So it's really, really hard for me to go back and revisit that and remember what I did. So don't ask me what I did, because I don't know. And I felt it worked at the time.
It was cool. Like, you brought in, like you said, Nephren-Ka and Carolyn as she's a reincarnation, I think, of Nephren-Ka's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
or at least I don't remember whether it was actual reincarnation or whether she had memories that were enforced upon her.
Right. And Jeb was also, like you explained how Jeb was Sneferu, or I forgot.
Yes. Yeah.
It was something. Yeah. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I listened to it, but yeah, I remember
he tied it in. He was part of that Egyptian history and
the Lovecraftian aspect. Like you worked into the Lovecraftian pantheon as well. And it's Path of Fate too, with having Dagon in there and all of that tying the Leviathan, which makes sense because that's what inspired the Leviathans. And I think to have a better understanding of the Leviathans, I think folks should read Lovecraft, especially the Dunwich Horror, for sure. But
sure. And some of August Derleth's work, the related work, I have a feeling that some of the stuff from the Leviathans also probably pulled as much from Derleth as Lovecraft. But rather than get back into those direct influences and everything, let's suffice it to say that Dark Shadows is absolutely pivotal in an awful lot of my work, whether it is overt or, like I said, more of an Easter egg, so a little tribute to the franchise.
And I love it when creators do that. And I wish more creators would do that. There should be more references to Dark Shadows in popular culture. I think the most recent one that comes to mind is the TV show Supernatural. Like the vampires were watching Dark Shadows in an episode of that show. Like things like that are really fun. And when you have a name drop of Collinsport, Maine or something like that, it's fun to see those things. And it helps to keep Dark Shadows to some degree, I think, in the pop cultural zeitgeist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I know a lot of people have said this, and this is slightly a tangent, but only slightly, because some shows have these great crossovers, and I think having Dark Shadows and Kolchak would have been just such a fucking great crossover.
That would have been great. They did a story that was
segue into something I wrote. I was in a Kolchak Night Stalker anthology called Passages of the Macabre. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a story called The Shadow of the Phoenix, which has Kolchak. Apparently, before he had that vampire case in Las Vegas, he was investigating a death of a woman in a fire.
Oh, wow.
Who had burnt with her kids.
I love that.
And that case all got forgotten with the vampire storyline. And it's a phoenix. It's not Laura Collins.
Okay. Oh, a different
But it's
Phoenix.
a different phoenix.
I love it.
When I was doing this, I was trying to tie this in also into Robert E. Howard, in that the first Conan story was Phoenix on a sword.
Mm-hmm.
It had a phoenix spirit battling the serpent god Set. So I was going to have now in Robert E. Howard, the phoenix was just a benevolent entity. I have the idea that the evil gods are, evil is a relative statement. There are evil gods opposed to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So I was making the phoenix god evil, and I was also going to bring in the serpent god. As I'm bringing in the serpent god, I said this is a great way to apply the Leviathans.
Cool.
I had to have a character being the human agent of the Leviathans. And I'm thinking about this. And I'm saying, since this is becoming a Dark Shadows homage, we had Lara Parker guest star on The Night Stalker.
Yes. Trevi collection. Yeah.
It was Madeline Perkins. And this was from Moonstone Books. And
Yeah.
Moonstone there's a problem with the Kolchak Night Stalker rights, in that they made it from novels that were originally published by Kev Rice. And Moonstone has the rights to the first two movies, Night Stalker and The Night Strangler, that Dan Curtis was involved with. But the TV series, which Dan Curtis was divorced from, they don't have the rights to that. So I asked, I wanted it, is it okay if I use the witch played by Lara Parker? And I was told you can't do that, but you could sort of use her if you don't call her Madeline Perkins.
Mm-hmm.
And don't allude, I had her in an asylum. I didn't explain totally how she got there, but that's where she ended up with at the end of the Night Stalker episode. So I had to give her an alias and have an explanation, sort of imply why she was with Madeline Perkins and the other. So I said she was born Angelica Waitley.
Oh, great.
She's related to the Waitley's of Dunwich.
Oh, I love it.
And
You're tying it all.
That's awesome.
She changed her name when she moved to Hollywood. Or not to actually, it was when she became a model. Then she changed it.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I love about stuff like that is that none of us create in a vacuum. We all have our influences and stuff. And without plagiarizing or without even calling too much attention to the source, I love when there's just something subtle that says, look, this came from here. Isn't that cool?
Yes, agreed. Moonstone also did a Kolchak crossover with Barnabas. There was a Barnabas Kolchak crossover, and Barnabas turns out was the
comic.
one. It's a comic, yes, that had turned Rainey into a vampire. It was Barnabas was the one responsible for that, or something. It was something to that effect. I have it somewhere, but
I haven't seen that, but I love it.
It's called Interview.
What a great idea!
Yeah,
it's called Interview with a Vampire, and he's invited to Collinwood to see Barnabas. Gets picked up by Willie at the train station, and Barnabas gives him a interview. And he reveals that Janice Crosani was part of his bloodline, in that I think one of his female victims became a vampire and bit Janice Crosani from the original Night Stalker.
Well, I know what I'm going to watch tonight. I haven't watched Night Stalker in years and years, so I'm going to be honest.
Darren McGavin is so much fun.
He is a folk hero. My God, I love
great. I saw him referred to once as in an article as the everyman's Van Helsing, which I loved. Yeah. Rick, are there any other ways in which you work Dark Shadows into your work, or is that the key one?
I've got another one.
Oh, go for it.
I've been doing the Taylor Shadowman primarily, and some of these have been collected in other books by Blackwell Press. There's a series called Shadow the Opera and Sisters of Shadow. I am sort of creating a fictional history of Supercrop. There's people like Professor Moriarty from Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, that's great. Cool.
And one character who who I could use without copyright problems. It was called Josephine Balsamo. Mm-hmm. And she is sort of, if Moriarty was the Napoleon of crime, she is literally the Josephine.
Oh, cool.
And in fact, she is the descendant from an illegitimate daughter of Empress Josephine. Now, the historical Josephine, who as I was doing the series, I came to conclude was the inspiration for Josette.
Oh, okay.
Because Josephine, historical Josephine, came from Martinique.
Oh.
And her descendant, Josephine Balsamo, appeared in a detective series about a master criminal named Arsène Lupin, and the author was Maurice Leblanc, which was very popular on both sides of the Atlantic up until the 1930s. And Josephine Balsamo, who starts in the 1890s a criminal career, is a gorgeous blonde who is there were like three Josephine Balsamos in history who are one is the granddaughter, and the other is the great-granddaughter of the original. And this creates the false impression. They all look alike, so it creates the false impression that Josephine Balsamo has been immortal. So I am looking at this. I said, I want to use this character. He's a blonde who has all these paintings from earlier time periods. It sounds a lot like Angelique. Uh-huh. It's also a little like the Phoenix, too. But so I write Josephine Balsamo very much like Angelique. And then just to add something more, I had a plot line where, since Josephine Balsamo is descended from the historical Josephine, she has relatives in Martinique. She had a distant, the original Josephine, the historical wife of Napoleon, had a cousin in Martinique who was the illegitimate daughter of a French merchant. If you've read Laura Parker's novels, you know where this is coming from.
Yeah.
And I said that cousin had a twin sister who was given a child to a cult, which was the King in Yellow cult.
Oh, cool.
Here we go. Now we're
tie in the King in Yellow.
Well, she's not, she couldn't become a saint and her name is Alexis.
Oh, wow, great.
And she becomes an immortal in this cult, but she doesn't know that that a twin sister also became a witch. And I think I want to have her at various times in history. And I'm probably going to have a story one day where she'll say something like, I did have something where they find out about Angelique's history. They find out Angelique exists. Yeah. But they conclude that she was this goody two-shoes who went off and married some guy in they believe the false story that had been spread by the Collins family.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. Yeah. Oh, that's great. But I'm gonna wrap it up. I am so thrilled that you both were able to take some time today to talk with me about the Leviathans. How can people find out more about your work and what you have coming up? If you guys want to give your websites out.
Okay, mine is just my full name, StephenMarkRainey.com, StephenMarkRainey.com, and I'm on. You just search for Mark Rainey on Facebook, because I go by Mark most of the time. If somebody calls me Stephen, they usually want money. But yeah, in my hometown there were 3 Mark Raineys and 2 Stephen Raineys, so I got confused for all of them. So I finally decided for writing, I'm just going to go by Stephen Mark Rainey, do the whole damn thing.
There you go. And
I just have an Amazon author page.
Amazon author page. Okay. I will definitely put links to both of those in the show notes. Guys, thank you again for joining me. Really had fun chatting with you about the Leviathans. So I hope listeners will give this storyline another chance after listening to what Mark and Rick had to say and putting a lot of this into context. It was really fascinating. So thank you, guys.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Folks, please do like and subscribe to the podcast. If you subscribe through Apple Podcasts, please do rate and review. That does help the podcast to grow and to reach more fans of Dark Shadows and classic horror. So spread the word, and thanks for listening.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at at Collinwood.